So before we begin, let me start off by polling the room. How many of you consider yourselves web devs, web developers? Okay. How many of you are solely doing mobile apps, like native apps? Okay, few. How many of you are neither? Backend devs, database devs? Okay, so like full stack? Okay, cool, awesome. Yeah, my goal here is to inspire you all to start making progressive web applications and show you guys the benefits of progressive web applications. So before we begin, let's thank our sponsors and our organizers for putting up such a great show. I think they've done a fantastic job. This is my first time in NDC, Minnesota, and what I've seen so far is phenomenal. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to thank the sponsors and the organizers for doing such a great job. Service workers, how to transform your application into a progressive web application. I want you all to meet my friend Jason. So who is Jason? Jason's an entrepreneur. He's also a developer. He's running a company, and he has a variety of clients. So two of the clients that I'm going to highlight, one of the clients is an ex-physician who basically tells Jason, hey, I want applications which would work in first responder type of scenarios. Or I want applications nurses could use on patients. So the other type of client that Jason has is a concert organizer. So that's a variety of clients that Jason has, right? He's running his company. And those, the concert organizers basically have concerts which are in the middle of the desert, right? So lately, these clients have been asking Jason a lot of new requirements. So Jason's been feeling very sad or very frustrated when these clients came up with some requirements. So they were basically asking, the physician was asking, hey, can you give me an application which is going to work in remote areas of the country? One of the reasons being we don't have really good internet over there, but I still want the application to work when I'm doing a first responder type of scenario, right? The second scenario was a concert organizer said, we have concerts in the middle of the desert, but I still want the attendees to be able to see the lineup of what bands are coming up next, what stage to go to. Now, Jason got really worried because he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to deliver on these requirements until he met his good friend, Progressive Web Apps. They partnered up. Basically, Progressive Web Apps came into Jason's rescue when he was down and said, hey, don't worry, I got your back, and they became best buddies. And Jason started feeling more like this person over here was really happy, the clients were happy, they were able to deliver on all the requirements, so things went really well. So who am I who narrated this story to you? My name is Avindra Fernando. I'm a developer based in Kansas City. I focus on front-end web development. So I've been doing it for over 6 years now. And lately, I'm trying to get into learning more about progressive web apps and hopefully trying to get you all excited to get into creating progressive web apps. That's my Twitter, and you guys can follow me on the other channels as well. So let's go back and ask ourselves the question, why did Jason get nervous? Before we answer this question, let's go back and see what are the current capabilities that we have today when we try to make mobile applications. So the first thing that we have are native apps. So native apps are apps which are geared towards certain devices or certain platforms. For example, the Apple iPhone, the Android phones, and if anyone's still using Windows phones, right? All of these have native applications related to that platform. So here, you get a great user experience because you're using native features of that device, native features of that platform. So the experience that a user gets is amazing, hands down. I think we can't really argue with that aspect. However, if you're in the business of creating native apps, that's when I think you're going to be spending a lot more money up front, right? So the reason for this is these platforms don't make applications using the same technologies. They don't make applications using the same languages. So if you are basically a shop creating Apple apps, then you have to hire developers and testers with a certain skill set. Similarly, if you also, now the client says, no, I want this to work on Android phone too, now those skill sets won't translate easily, right? So now you have to go hire a set of developers and testers with different skill sets. And that's one issue. The second issue is, imagine if you have a bug in one code base. Now you have to keep track of fixing it in the other code base, and it's going to be very challenging to run a business if you have to cater to all of these devices, right? So that's one downfall, I think, with native apps. The second, so as an answer to this, we came up with a concept called hybrid apps. So why don't we hire a set of individuals with a certain skill set, and we write the code once, we maintain one code base per application, and we do the testing for that application, but when we generate the builds or when we release, then let's send them based on what the platform we're trying to do, right? So we saw a lot of these technologies or frameworks come about which allowed us to create hybrid apps. So that was great for businesses, except when you try to deploy the application on the device, the user experience that people got weren't 100%. So now the users got a little bit upset. Hey, why doesn't this work on my iPhone 10, which has a notch on top, right? So now you got to account for a lot of those scenarios. Although you're maintaining one code base and you're fixing bugs in one place, you still had to worry about what's going to happen when you deploy this application to these devices. So then the industry said, OK, let's try to figure out a solution for what's happening here. And they came up with what I like to call cross-platform native apps. So how many of you are from like a C# type of background or a Java? I mean, familiar with Xamarin? OK. How many of you are JavaScript? OK. Anyone know what this is? React Native, right, for mobile applications. So these technologies came about and said, all right, we'll try to solve the problem. It's still a hybrid app, but we're going to try to leverage a lot of the native capabilities of the device. But if you ask the developers who are working with these technologies, they would still tell you that for Xamarin, you still have to worry about Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android at the release step. And same with React Native, right? You make the application, however, you got to have Xcode installed if you want to release the application for an iPhone, and you still have to have Android Studio configured and installed if you want it to be released to the Play Store. So we're still not there yet. Now then, someone would ask a question, why don't we consider the mobile web? So the mobile web is the philosophy of just making a web application, right? And you configure it to work on a mobile device by changing the layouts, changing the CSS, so items would wrap around, and it would give an experience. However, the user experience here is not very native-like. You still have to go to the browser and load up the web application and then scroll up and down, right? It doesn't really feel like you're using a mobile application. So people are not very happy with the mobile web alone, right? So these are the capabilities that Jason knew. So native apps, hybrid apps, cross-platform native apps, and the mobile web is what Jason knew when the clients approached him with these requirements. So that's the reason why Jason got nervous, because he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to deliver on some of the requirements that the clients were asking for. Progressive web apps. So progressive web apps is still the mobile web, but it's an extension to the mobile web. It just took what the mobile web could do and like enhanced the capabilities of it, so it's going to work like a mobile application on your mobile device. There are a certain set of principles which go into making progressive web applications. So there are three main principles. The first principle is your app has to be reliable. What I mean by this is your app has to work when there is internet, and your app has to work when there's no internet. Now, I don't mean all the content of the application. However, it's a very bad user experience when your user loads up the app and there's no internet and they get the down and swore page, right? So they can start playing that game. That's not a very good user experience. Instead, what if we loaded the shell? We loaded some pages so they can still interact with the application and they get the full content when they have access to internet, right? And then we can start syncing up. So one of the philosophies is your app has to be reliable. It can't just automatically stop working when there's no internet. Because there are legit scenarios that we do not have access to the internet for one reason or the other. The second philosophy, or the second principle, is your app has to be fast, or it has to act like it's fast so that you can retain the users. So this is when there is slow internet. Not everywhere. We're lucky enough to have pretty fast internet, but I think there are some areas across the world, even in the United States, who don't have great internet, right? Those users, we got to think about those users as well. So can we still deliver some content to those users so they can start interacting with our application? And when they get access to fast internet, then they can get the other content, right? So your app has to appear like it's fast or actually be fast. So that's the second principle of a progressive web application. The third and last principle is because progressive web apps are being used on mobile devices, they need to feel engaging. They need to look, feel, and act like a mobile application. It cannot feel like a web application that you're pulling up on a browser, right? So the installation experience also plays a major part into the engaging aspect of these applications. So today, if we want to go get a mobile application, we have to go to the Play Store, or we got to go to the App Store, search for the application, click install, and that's when we get the application. With progressive web apps, they made it much easier to install an application. And I will show you demos on how we can get that. All right. So now we know the principles. Now let's look at the different elements which go into making the secret sauce for making a progressive web application. The first element is the web app manifest file. The web app manifest file is simply a JSON configuration that you ship with your web application, which is going to tell the browser how your app should behave when it's in an install state, right? So this is going to contain information like what's the name of the application, what is the icon that you're going to display of the application. When you click on it, how do you want it to display? Should it be full screen or should it be standalone? Should it be minimal UI? So there are different properties that you can configure so that the app, when the user loads the app, how it looks. So that is one of the key elements of a progressive web application. So here is an example of a very simple progressive web application. It doesn't do a whole lot. It just makes a really annoying air horn noise, right? But the great news is it works offline. So you can use it when you don't have internet to kind of prank your colleagues. Okay. The second and the most important element is the service worker file. The service worker file is also, at its simplest, it's a script which helps you manage caching of your application. Caching requests, caching content, caching data. You as a developer can decide how much you want to cache and what to be cached. But service worker is what basically made the progressive web app's dream come true. So for the amount of work that they do, I like to think of them as people who are hard at work. But honestly, I think because service workers are what made this dream come true, so I think we should treat them as superheroes, right? This is what revolutionized the way we do mobile applications. So how does this all work? So let's go and look how a service worker works and what the lifestyle of a service worker is. So first, when you ship your application, it starts off with detecting that your application does not have any service worker. So that's the first state. This is the first time that you try, the browser detects that, oh, there are no service workers available. Then it's going to detect that, oh, your application is a progressive web application. It has a service worker file. Now I need to register it and basically install it. So it's going to go into an install state first. Then two things could happen. Number one, it could successfully install, or it could fail. If it did successfully install, it's going to go into an activated state. Once it's activated, then from that point onwards, it just keeps track of all the requests which are incoming and outgoing, and also things like push requests and through the messaging protocol as well. So it mostly remains idle. And then once you have requests come and go, it's going to keep track of all of those requests. Now you can decide which ones you want to cache and how you want to cache them. If it's doing a lot of work and then all of a sudden the app shuts down, it still runs on the background. So to save memory, it would go into a terminated state. However, the next time a request comes or a push notification comes, it's going to automatically wake up and go back to doing work. So this is the high-level architecture of how a service worker works. So I mentioned there are some cases where a service worker would not install in the first try, right? So let's look at some of the cases which would cause the service worker not to install in the right way. So there are three things mentioned here. The first thing is your domain. So when you give your service worker, make sure that you are registering it under the root domain, unless you have an exception. So for example, if it's example.com, make sure your service worker is pointing to the path of example.com, so it can listen to all the traffic underneath. If you do register it accidentally under a different domain, for example, example.com/music, then it's only going to know about requests coming, incoming and outgoing requests on example.com/music, nothing above it, right? So the domain is very critical that you have to keep track of. If not, you're going to start seeing errors in the console saying couldn't find service worker or it didn't register fine. That's when you'll go back and revisit and see what domain is it trying to listen to, right? And there are exceptions. As developers, a lot of us have a lot of freedom and creativity. If we have an exception, yeah, then that's fine. But by default, make sure that it's under the parent domain. The second thing is service workers will only work over HTTPS. Can anyone guess why? Any guesses? Security concerns, right? With great power comes great responsibility, right? So I mentioned service workers are tracking or intercepting all your traffic. So imagine if someone hacks into it, or if it's a man-in-the-middle attack, we're now being compromised. So service workers, at a minimum, have enforced that it's only going to work over HTTPS. I could see this restriction kind of being more tight in the future now that we have a push towards a lot of security topics being discussed in the industry these days. The third is just like your domain, the folder structure matters as well. The service worker, the register service worker file should be under the parent root folder. If you do put it somewhere down below, then it's not going to be able to know about any of the other files sitting outside of it, right? So it may not work as expected. So these are things to watch out for. There are more, but I think these are the 3 things to watch out for. If your service worker is not installing properly, it's probably one of these 3 reasons. Okay. Another main feature of progressive web applications, which got uncovered as a result of service workers, is the ability to receive and send push notifications. So the way this works on a web application is the first step is to get permission from the user. If the user says, no, I do not want any notifications, that's it, right? You have to respect the wish of the user. So once you get the permission, then you can take that subscription and save it on your server saying, these are the people who have subscribed to receive notifications from my application. Now, when it comes time to send a notification, you can send it to the web push protocol, and it will arrive at the user's mobile device. However, at this point, the user still does not see the notification. It has just arrived in the device. The last step is once the message is in the user's device, it will then notify the browsers saying, hey, do you have any active service workers right now? If you do, wake them up and dispatch this notification. So that's where I mentioned earlier that service workers could be terminated, right? If it's sitting idle for too long to save memory. But when something like this happens, it's going to wake up, it's going to go back to work and say, all right, I got a new notification, now I need to dispatch it. And that's when the user will see the notification that you're sending them. So this was one of the big advantages of progressive web apps, because mobile developers and the users of mobile apps would tell this was a huge thing that they wanted. And progressive web apps got it to work a few years ago. And it's constantly evolving, so more and more capabilities of the native mobile applications are now being added or being supported by the concept of progressive web applications. All right, so now you all may ask the question, right? Who's on board with this idea? Let's ask the browsers. As of today, all of the major browsers are on board with supporting service workers. Chrome and Firefox were the first to the game, and then Edge. So unfortunately, it's not going to work in legacy IE, but it is supported in Edge, and it will be supported in Safari and in iOS Safari as well. So now we can get a lot of the basic functionality of a service worker or a progressive web application through the browsers. And I see this, all the browsers embracing a lot more features and a lot more functionalities related to the native capabilities in the future. So all the browsers are on board. That's good news. Now, what about the frameworks? All of them are on board as well, right? So I want to poll the room once again. How many of you are using Angular? Quite a few. Okay. How many of you React? Okay. Anyone using the new kid on the block? 2. Okay, cool. So today's demo is going to be in Vue. I have given this talk in Angular. However, let me tell you, the concepts are the same, right? So you should be able to apply these concepts into React, these concepts into Angular very, very easily, because all the frameworks have the capability for you to transform your application into a progressive web application very, very easily. In fact, React comes with Create React App, you get this by default. But with Vue and Angular, there's a couple of commands that you need to run, and you can get the bare bones very, very quickly. And that's what I'm going to show you and explain to all of you what it's doing under the hood. Okay? Everyone ready? Okay. So with the Vue CLI 3.0, service workers are now built in. There's 2 packages that they added. They added the Vue CLI plugin PWA and the register service worker package, which has a lot of the functionalities built in to transform your application into a progressive web application. So in Vue, all you really do is once you have your application built, you can add a new package under the Vue namespace called PWA, and that's it. This is the magic command that you run, and your application's now a progressive web application. And for Angular, it's pretty much the same. I think with version 5, they added some support, and with version 6, it comes with the CLI. And React comes with all of this out of the box. So all of these would be included. Now let's go see, when you run this command, what did it really do? I know it made it a progressive web application, but I'm not happy unless I really understand what's going on, right? So I'm someone who likes to go investigate under the hood, so I'm going to explain to all of you what these commands are doing behind the scenes. Okay, so it modified a whole bunch of files. Now let's look at each one individually. So in the package.json, you can see that it added the 2 packages. The first one is the register service worker package, and also the CLI plugin PWA. So it added a new file called manifest.json. So this is your web app manifest file. This is a file which tells the browser how your app should behave when it's installed, right? So let's go back and look at the properties. And this is going to look very similar across all frameworks. The first one is the name. So this is a name that you want to give your application. Now, I haven't given a great name, and you guys can come up with a really nice name. The short name is essentially if you're working with really small devices, what name should it display for your application, right? If it does not have space to render the big name, then make sure you give a short name as well for your application. So the device is smart enough to render it based on the screen size available to the application. The second, by default, it is including 2 icons. You can add many icons as you want. So it's added an icon which is 192 by 192, and the other one's 512 by 512, right? So this is where you would swap out your icons, and I would recommend you at least provide, in the web app manifest file, 2 icons. You can do more, but then make sure that you give the 192 by 192 and the 512 by 512, so that your users could get a great experience when they're working on a tablet versus when they're working on a phone, which has got really small screen size. Okay? Starting URL, by default, Vue would point to the index.html. The other frameworks would do the same, unless you have a different starting point. So you can go configure it and say, no, my app doesn't start at the index.html. I want it to start here, and then you would modify that property. Display standalone. Anyone has a guess on what that is? So I'll mention the options. You have standalone, you have full screen, you have minimal UI, and you have browser. Okay, so this is when the user clicks on your application, how should it look? So standalone basically is a default, and it's saying it's going to look like a mobile application. Now, if you select browser, then the difference is it's going to still show your application, but it's also going to show the address bar on top, right? So it's not going to necessarily look like a mobile application. If you have a use case that you want to show the address bar on top, you can still do that. Full screen just takes control over the whole area, right? So this is how you would configure how your app would look in the manifest.json file. And lastly, these are for something called a splash screen. So this is a split second when you click on the icon, and the time that your app loads, the browsers and the devices would render something called a splash screen. So these are the colors that you can give, or you can even configure your own custom splash screen that'll, I think, become a better user experience. Okay, so the next one is the register service worker JS file. This file is a lot of the implementation's done under the hood, but here you can see that the main key is it's looking against production. And again, this is because of the HTTPS restriction, right? You can generate a build which, if you're doing dev and you want to test it, I would recommend either you set up a web server on your local machine, which is going to respond to HTTPS requests, or you generate the production build and use a different server to test. Because this restriction, I see it being even more and more restricted in the future. And this is a security thing that they're adding, so they want to make sure that this does not impact the users. So that's why the production thing, but you can modify it. Here you see a lot of callbacks. So this is when you detect, hey, is my service worker ready? Is my service worker registered? Is my service worker caching stuff? Do I have new content available? So these are things that you can use in Vue to basically take control over your service worker file and say, hey, when the requests are cached, I want to do this, right? So this would be your entry point to taking control over what you want to do when these events are fired. Okay. So this would be then referenced from your main file, and that's another thing that adds under the hood. So that's where you would import your register service worker file in a Vue application. Similar things happen for the other frameworks as well. By default, Vue gives you a lot of icons. These are for different devices, but create your own icons, be creative, and swap them out with your own icons for your application. But if you're starting it out and you want to play with it, these icons would suffice, right? Another tool that I want to show, which is going to help you all a lot when you're trying to convert your application into a progressive web application, is the tool called Lighthouse. How many of you have heard of it? What do you use it for? Because it can do way more than PWAs. Performance? Cool, yep. So Lighthouse is an extension in Chrome that you can install very easily. It comes under the Audits tab, and it's going to be able to run audits against your web application. So there are different audits. There are performance audits, there are SEO audits, best practices. So this is a great tool, and I recommend all of you to start using it because it gives you a lot of feedback on how you can improve your web application. One of the audits is also the progressive web apps audit. So it's going to tell you, it's going to give you feedback and say, hey, your application does not have a web app manifest file. Your application does not respond to a 200 when it's offline. So everyone ready for a demo? All right. So here, I've created an application which is not a PWA. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Lighthouse tool to run an audit and to get feedback to see what I need to do to convert it to a progressive web application. And I'm not going to go alone. Along with all of you, I'm going to invite my friend, the Minion. But the Minion's very skeptical, so ignore the Minion for now. All right. So I have my application here. It's basically a simple application showing a home page with a paragraph, and then I'm just loading a bunch of posts. So it's just some random photos. So it's not a very complicated application for this demo. So what I'm going to do, let's go back. Can everyone see the audits in the back? Can you read it? Okay. Better? Okay. All right. So if you do inspect element, and if you do go to your audits tab, that's basically the Lighthouse tool. You can also install it through plugins, but it's essentially the same thing. So here, you can see that you can select what type of audit you want to run and what internet you want to simulate. So I'm going to go with the defaults, and I'm going to select the Progressive Web Apps Audit to get some feedback on how it's going to work. All right, so let's give it a second. All right, so it gave me some feedback. So what's it saying? Before May 1st, so that kind of confused me. Before it was giving a score out of 100, but then they changed with the Lighthouse version 3, they changed the way they give you the initial feedback. So here you see like a minus sign basically saying that your app is not a progressive web application. That's the overall feedback, and you can hover over it, and it's going to tell you exactly what things you're missing to make it a progressive web application. So here I passed one of the audits, but this is one of the key things, right? The current page does not respond to a 200 when offline. So if I shut off the internet, my application is not going to work. It's going to show the dinosaur page. So that's one of the feedback that I got. So here, does not register a service worker that controls page and starting URL, right? So it's going to know right off the bat that you do not have a service worker file, or you do not have the manifest.json file. So this is great feedback that I can use to convert my application into a progressive web application, right? So if anyone is wanting to implement their own service worker files and manifest.json files, I think this feedback is really helpful. However, the frameworks have made it a little bit easier because I showed you that one command that in Vue that you can run, which is going to create all of these files for you, Angular the same way and React the same way. However, you can still, based on this feedback, go and implement your own service worker file, your own manifest.json file, and your own connectors on how it's going to function. All right, so now let's go and see. Let's go and ask the minions if they're ready to see what happens when the app is converted. So they're really happy. So let's go and look at an app which is now being converted to a progressive web application. So how do I know this is a PWA? Because the title says it. Right. Well, no. Let's go verify, right? So I'm going to do the same thing. It looks exactly the same, except some of the text, right? The application still is doing the same thing. Now if I do inspect, audits, I'm going to run the same audit, progressive web app, run audit. And now saying, hey, I passed, right? Now it gives me feedback saying your application is a progressive web application. So, which means your application responds with some content when there's no internet. Your application has a manifest.json file. Your application has a service worker file was successfully registered. So all of this feedback is now helpful for me to figure out what I need to go fix. And if you're noticing one of them is missing, even after your framework helped you transform, then you can go and address it one by one, right? But most frameworks would make sure that the basics are covered. All right, so let's go back and see how my application, so I'm showing you the web application. Now we can go back and see how it's going to behave on a mobile device. So I have a little recording here. So the way you install it is you first go to the browser, and you have to visit the URL. So this is your first step. Once you go to that page, then in your browser, there's an option to say add to home screen. So you can do that with Chrome. You can also do that with Safari. The placements of these options are in different places, but just look for the option add to home screen. Right? So the very first time, this is how you would install a progressive web application. Once you do that, that's it. Go back to your home page, home screen, and there is your application, right? It's now, from this point onwards, it looks and acts and feels like a mobile application. That's it. So there is no more going to the Play Store, no more going to the App Store to install your mobile applications. The one time, go to the browser of your choice, select Add to Home Screen. Once you get it, then it's going to be on your home screen forever until you remove it, right? And it's going to be running in the background for push notifications. It's going to be running in the background for any traffic incoming and outgoing. And you might not see it, but a lot of things are happening under the hood with service workers. Cool? All right, so now we have to extend it. So what we've seen so far is the basics of what the framework gave us, right? Now, this is not enough, because we want to make sure that we take control over the service worker file so that we can customize our application to do different things that we prefer. For example, when new content is available, I may not want to refresh the screens right away. Or maybe I want to refresh the screen right away. There's a screen that I really want to refresh right away. I want the user to see it. But the key is I have to take control over it. So I'm going to show what we need to do in a view ecosystem on how to take control over this application. Again, the concepts should be similar. So if you're from a different framework, you should be able to easily find how to do the same actions. All right. So the first thing that you have to do is go to your view config file. So this is basically your main configuration file, and then you have to add a certain set of options. So add the PWA object, and then there's two main things. Workbox plugin mode, inject manifest, workbox options, and the path to your service worker file. So what you would do is you would create a custom service worker file, and this is where you would give the reference to the custom service worker file. I would recommend in the Vue ecosystem to name it service-worker.js. You can give a custom name, but then you have to go back to the register service worker file and make sure you change the name. So Workbox is basically a plugin developed by Google, which is open source, that is going to support offline capabilities for your web application. So you may not see it right away, but all of these frameworks, so Angular, React, and Vue, are using Workbox under the hood to make all of this happen. So here what you're doing is the default option is called generate SW, generate service worker. So it looks for your register service worker file, and if you have that option, then it generates a service worker file which it's going to ship when you do the build step. Here instead, you're saying, don't do that, because I want my custom service worker file, right? So to take control of that, you just have to say inject manifest. So that's the option that you say, hey, I'm in control now, right? So you won't be generating a default service worker file. And the next thing is you give the option and the path to where this file can be found. All right, so then this is your custom service worker file. Doing very minimal things in this example, but you would be adding a lot of logic and branching off of it so that you can control your application. The first three lines are basically these three lines. If you look at, before you do the custom conversion, if you go look at what the service worker file got generated by default, you can see these three lines at the end of that file. And essentially, you're including it because this is what pre-caches your assets. So you want to make sure now that you're taking control over generating the service worker, you include these three lines. So essentially what they're doing is they are pre-caching the assets that you want it to pre-cache. After that point, it's your custom event listeners and things like that that you can use to detect certain actions. So here I have an event listener, which is listening for the messaging protocols. And basically, it has an action of skip. It's looking for an action of skip waiting, and it's invoking the skip waiting method for the service worker. Skip waiting is basically, so in service workers, you can only have one service worker active at a time. For example, if your user opens up one tab and another tab, we do not want two service workers to fire up because of your now caching request. So you can have undesired consequences when you do that. So by design, service workers are configured to register only one service worker at a time. If a new service worker comes, so service workers could refresh when your assets refresh, right? So if your content changes, then you would get a new copy of the service worker. However, it waits until the old one releases all the clients. So all the tabs should be closed, and they should be gone before the new one gets a turn to register themselves. Now, in skip waiting, for this example I'm showing you, is skip waiting basically says, I don't care. Kill the old one, instead install the new one, right? So that's basically forcing you to say, I want the new service worker every time my content updates, right? All right. So now you go back to your parent register service worker file, and in here, you can add this event wherever, but I'm going to show you in the next slide how you would reference this. So what I want to do in this case is, when there is new content available, I want to basically show the user a notification saying, hey, there's new content available, and click refresh. That's my use case. A lot of freedom for all of you to implement it however you like. So here, essentially, it's just showing a snack bar real quick and saying, hey, you have new content available. Click refresh, and you'll get the new content. And lastly, this is a key line. Remember, so this one's basically invoking sending a post message through the post message. So it's sending the event type of message with an action called skip waiting. So if you go back to what I had here, that's what's going to invoke this step and then ensure that it's going to call the skip waiting method of the workbox. Okay? All right. So finally, you had all of these callbacks that Vue provided on if your service worker was successfully registered, successfully caching stuff, if new updates can be found. So then here, the updated method, I'm going to be adding that custom snack bar event that I created to here. So here, I'm basically saying, so you get the registration object by default. Registration.waiting is the worker that it's associated to. And that's it. So now, I have taken control over the service worker by creating a custom service worker, and I'm trying to dispatch an event when there's new content available, and I want to give the freedom to the user to say, you refresh, and you try to get the new content. All right, so let's see all of this in action. Okay, everyone ready? All right. So first step, I'm going to go make a content change, right? So I'm going to load up my home.view, which is basically the text that you saw in my application. I'm going to change my heading to my updated heading. So, and then I'm going to save that. And now I have to generate a production build. For my, when I was doing all this development, I was deploying this to a different server. It was as quick as spinning up a dev server, which is configured to be an HTTPS. So here I made a change up top. I made a change to my heading. It initially said, welcome to I'm a PWA. Now I've updated it and generated my build. Now, I was using Firebase to deploy my application. Can use whichever provider or whichever host provider that you use for deploying your application. So my application now is deployed to Firebase with the change I just made. All right? So now, next step is we're going to go to the browser. We're going to go to the browser, and I'm going to visit my web page. And I should expect the change that I made to be there. So let's see what happens. Okay? All right. Ooh, I still get the old content, right? I don't see my change, but what do I see down below? You see new content is available, and you have a refresh button. And I click the refresh button, I got the new content, right? So this is not a mistake. This is basically a service worker has cached your old assets, and it wanted, because I said, wait until, give the freedom to the user to refresh, and then they got the new content, right? Now, you can take control over and say, no, this page is critical. I want to refresh right away. You can do that. If it's not critical, leave it alone for maybe refresh in 15 minutes, right? Freedom is up to the developer. Cool? All right, so that was it in action. I want to share with all of you a collection of really cool progressive web apps that the people in the industry have built. The URL is pwa.rocks, and this has a collection of a lot of the businesses that they're actually running their business in production using a PWA, or like pet projects, people created games and things like that. So great site for you to go look at them. One of the notable examples here is under the business section, and there is an app called Flipkart. Has any of you heard of Flipkart? You're nodding. You've heard of it? Yep. So it is basically like the Amazon.com of India. It is an e-commerce giant, and they converted their application into a progressive web application, and they're running this in production, and they have been running it in production for a while, and they're a very successful company in India, right? So you have the Twitter Lite app, you have Wikipedia has a progressive web application. Again, there are some really cool apps in production, and also some pet projects that you can play with. And you got that air horner app that I demoed earlier, right? Yep, a great resource. So pwa.rocks. You have a question?
Yeah, back in the day, we used to build hybrid apps for open apps.
Yep.
With credential cache on the device,
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. That is up to you. That doesn't happen by default with PWAs, right? What you want to cache is up to you. Sure. Yes. Yeah. Sure, absolutely. Yep. The question, the very first question was, what about user credentials? And the answer is, I think it's up to the developer on how they want to implement it. Progressive web applications, by default, does not cache user credentials. Yep.
So the three things that would happen, current, backup, and not running at all. You just got to notification that that's not running at all.
What do you mean by not running at all? So,
Running a background, you shut the thing down, it's not at all. It's not completely shut down.
okay. So it's really the browser that's doing it. So if the browser is completely shut off, then it's not going to work. Yes. So the question was, what about apps running in the background, basically not running at all? So in progressive web applications, it's really the browser which does all this magic. So you want to make sure the browser is open. It could be minimized or it could not be there, but the browser has to still be running. But if the browser is completely shut off, then your app is shut off. Yep. Okay. Yes. The question was, I've been looking into building progressive web applications, and one of the key features I need is geolocation capabilities. Where are they at today? There is a website that I want to show. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to try to get it from this tab. Is that mirrored? Okay. All right. So it's called What the Web Can Do Today. And if you use it, if you open it up using your browser, so if you open it up using Chrome or Safari, it's going to tell you what capabilities does your browser support. So in this case, you can see all of them. So let me zoom it real quick. You can see what it supports. So here, my browser supports all of these native behaviors, right? And geolocation is supported, but geofencing is not, right? So you can load up using the browser of your choice to see if the browser has caught up and supporting those features, okay? It's called What the Web. Let me share the URL real quick. What the Web can do .today. All right, so going back. All right, so we've learned a lot about progressive web applications, and I'm sure all of you will be in one of these camps before you walk out of here today. So either you're going to be one of these people, like Jonah Hill, very excited, can't wait, just going to go try it out. Or you're really excited, but you don't want to show your emotions out loud, right? So you're going to be in that camp. Or you're like, it's a cool idea, you know, maybe it'll work. But thumbs up anyway. And lastly, you might be a skeptic like Ron Swanson. It's like, I'm not sure, this is probably not the future, you know. So either way, you're probably going to be in one of these camps. But I want to tell you that I think for the capabilities that progressive web apps have uncovered and adding daily, and the ease of installation and the ease of use, so that you don't have to build a separate web application and a separate mobile application, I think this will be the future of how we create mobile applications. All right. Well, thank you very much. We've still got time for questions. I think I have about 5 minutes. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Caching limits. So the question is about like limits of what the browsers could provide. I would suggest, like, although this would uncover that you can cache, don't cache all of it because you're going to run into the limits very, very soon. This concept is so that when someone does not have internet, they can at least have a couple of pages, some critical pages of your application that they can interact with, right? You still would have to wait until internet comes back, and you can decide, okay, these pages are absolutely critical. It is a first responder type of scenario. They need to enter the vitals of a patient. Or if the concert goers, right, it's like, I want to see the lineup. I really want to see what's next. And if you can give that level of information and then maybe hide the others so that they can use it when there's internet, that would be good. But I would not recommend caching the whole world. Yeah. Yeah. Hybrid apps, so mobile web is basically still a web application. It's built for the browser. A hybrid apps is an app that you build and you ship through the Play stores, ship through the App Store. Question in the back.
Yeah, I've been struggling with turning an Angular app into a PWA lately. And
Okay.
I feel like the debugging tools, I'm either ignorant of them or they're just not good. What's your recommendation for debugging?
Sure. So that's interesting because even for Angular, I believe it was just one command to convert your application. It was including the PWA package. It's been a while since I've done it. So that did not.
Installing the package was fine.
Okay.
I ran into strange caching problems that would happen after deployment of the new version. And it was difficult to reason about what was going on.
Okay.
I wanted tooling to enable me to observe the system and debug it.
Sure.
But it seemed like the stuff that was happening in the service worker wasn't available to my debugger.
Okay. Yep. The service worker. So the question was, when I'm debugging an application, why can't I really see a lot of things which are happening with the service worker? I think it's still under a lot of development. Service workers are running in the background. So I can show you here where you can go see some of the service workers that in your application if you look under the application tab, that's where you would find what's really happening with your service worker, right? You can see it's right now in an active state, and then you can basically unregister it or start like removing it and start over. However, you're right. There is really no, at least I haven't found like really good ways to debug what your service worker is doing after it comes to the browser.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a lot of new development going on at this point. So I would hope that they come up with tools or extensions to the Chrome extensions, and we can kind of see step by step what it's doing after it comes to the browser.
Okay.
Cool.
Thanks.
Yep. Yeah.
So I remember when you were talking about getting like the app-like experience, usually going to the settings and the add to home screen
Mm-hmm.
option. Is there any other ways to get that kind of like app-like experience, or just use your app switcher and then you do that sort of stuff?
Okay. Question was, how do you install it? So I demoed a way you just go to the browser and do add to home screen. Is there a different way to install it? As far as I know, no. So are you thinking of like a much easier way than that as well?
Yeah,
Okay.
is there any other way of just going through the settings? Because I don't know how you
It's gotcha. It's not through the settings of the phone. It's through the settings of the browser or the ellipsis menu of your browser. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Question is, can we still do PWAs through the App Store? The quick answer is no, because this is essentially a web application. It's geared towards making it more usable for the mobile audience. Yeah. All right. All right, I think we're out of time, so thank you guys.